Hello, everybody, and welcome to Are You Ready to Garden? My name is Bill Lubick, and we have some great co-hosts here tonight, including my buddy Ray Samuelis, who we're bringing out of retirement for this next 2 months only, maybe, or maybe we can bring him out for longer. Sitting 6 feet away from him is Rich Weidman, and we have Bill Erickson here. Bill Erickson is one of our new agents in Monmouth County and doing a terrific job out there in Monmouth. And we have our engineer, Dave Smella, working with us tonight. We're actually going to talk about solving pest and disease and animal problems in and around your landscape. For those of you that joined us on part one, just a tiny bit of overview, but we're going to get right into some other topics on other pest and disease problems that we were not able to cover on the first round. So without further ado, let's get started tonight. Here's a picture of our greenhouse. Actually, our greenhouses now in high tunnels and even fields are in full production of tomatoes and sweet corn is out there. So, a lot of farms now have a lot of products available right now, including blueberries and sweet corn. We're going to get through this a little bit when we show you some of our videos today. But there's a lot of pick your own going on throughout the state. And you can find information on the pick your own throughout the state with going to findjerseyfresh.com, and you'll actually see a link. It'll give you information on the type. You put in your location and you put in how many miles away you're looking out to find a farm, whether it's in 5 or 10 mile radius of where you live or 25 miles. And it'll also give you information about the types of products that those farms offer. So, we recommend that you use these two sites because they are updated on a regular basis, but you still might want to call ahead or look on their actual website. And we highly encourage you to support our local farmers throughout the state of New Jersey because they work very hard. And as it is for everybody, this is a particularly difficult year for all of our farmers. So make sure to visit our farmers and support them as much as you can. And it gives your family a chance to get out of the house, take a little vacation, go out and pick your own freshest and best tasting vegetables on the planet and small fruits as well. So last time we were talking about keeping plants healthy, and just a quick overview before we get into some specifics, and Bill's going to get started here in a second, Bill Erickson. But we talked about how it's important for all plants, whether they be trees, shrubs, vegetables, fruits, whatever, that we have healthy microorganisms within the soil, that we got proper fertility. We don't want to over-fertilize plants because plants, if we over-fertilize them, can become more susceptible to disease and insect problems. So it's very important that we follow the fertility guidelines coming out of our soil test labs. And if you haven't tested your soil, make sure that you send a sample in to Stephanie Murphy at the Soils Lab at Rutgers, and we'll provide information if you jump on our website of how to do that. And fertility is extremely important, especially in vegetable gardens or anytime you're trying to produce fruits or vegetables. So having a soil test is your first start. So you don't want to have products that are over-fertilized or under-fertilized. If they're under-fertilized, they're not going to grow properly and you won't get adequate production. If they're over-fertilized, too much fertilizer, you could increase the potential for disease and insect problems, especially in the hotter part of the season. Moisture is extremely important. We want an adequate flow of moisture to those root systems, but we don't want to over irrigate these areas. We want to make sure that we're providing water as needed, deeply and frequently, but enough water that the plant is not under heat stress and drought stress. Making sure the plant's getting adequate light. Most of our vegetables require anywhere from 8 to 10 hours of full sunlight. Many of our greens can get along with much less light and perform favorably. And then oxygen is very important. We don't often think of oxygen down in the soil as being important, but it really is because oxygen helps to transport water and other nutrients up through the plant and keep the plant roots healthy. So these are all the basic components you need to keep healthy plants in any ecosystem. And plants are adapted to their local conditions, and this is very important. If you look at how plants are found, where they're found in nature, for instance, rhododendrons and azaleas and other ericaceous type plants, usually they're between 10 and 15% shade, and they're in areas where they have adequate moisture. relatively high organic matter with all the leaves falling around them, and that's where they perform best in those environments under steady flow of nutrients but not overly fertilized. And also the pH would be lower with these plants because they will do better. The microorganisms will do better in the soil in terms of translocating those nutrients in through the root systems. So it's a slow recycling of nutrients in those within those systems. So keeping those microorganisms healthy is really critical in any system if we want to reduce stress on plants and reduce disease problems. So keeping beneficial fungi and other microbes and bacteria and actinomycetes all healthy within that soil is extremely important. So there are ways where we can increase organic matter in any system, which is extremely important if we're going to keep those plants healthy. We talked about recycling grass clippings back onto lawns, and that's the very best thing you can do. One of our scientists, Dr. Joe Heckman, over the years has done work with this, and he's shown that recycling grass clippings back to the lawn actually provides anywhere from 30 to 50% of the nitrogen needs of many of our turf grass species. So
Bill, I was going to mention about soil microorganisms.
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
Some people don't know this, but there was a famous scientist at Rutgers in one of the buildings that Bill and I frequented there for a while, Dr. Selman Waxman. Dr. Waxman was a soil scientist who discovered and developed streptomycin from the soil. So it had implications throughout saving many hundreds of thousands of soldiers and other people from infection early in the 1900s. So there's very important organisms in the soil, a lot of which we don't even really know what they are.
You bring up a good point, Ray, that sometimes when you're looking for one thing in research, you find something else that can make a difference in the entire planet and save a lot of lives. And, you know, that coming out of plant science research at an agricultural college, these sorts of things are not uncommon at a university where we're looking for one thing. And, Bill, you have an example of that, too. Bill Erickson's been working with some great scientists at Rutgers, and you've also found some interesting bacteria. Why don't you just tell us a minute about that?
Yeah, so we've been working with soil organisms that came from the pine barrens, and we've been using them in turf grass. So if we think about the microorganisms and the plants that live in the pine barrens, they're adapted to live in low fertility, sandy soils, drought stress, heat stress, acidic conditions, so some really tough conditions. And so the microbes, the soil microbes that evolved there, have a symbiotic relationship with the plants to help the plants better survive in those conditions. And so as we're trying to develop, low input lawns, our turf grass can form this association with these beneficial bacteria to be able to survive drought better and heat better and require less inputs. So we're working on getting those bacteria sort of into biofertilizer products that can be commercially available. And that's some of the research that's going on at Rutgers right now.
It's pretty exciting research because we're working with Bill now and testing that on a few production crops and seeing what kind of impact we have with it. Also, back when I was in graduate school, about 100 years ago or so, right, Ray? We were working on
dinosaurs, Bill, or after?
What's that?
Dinosaurs?
It's after the Civil War. So let's just stick with that. We were working with trichoderma species, Trichoderma hirzinum and viridae, and those are two great species that if we encourage those beneficial fungi, it can actually help us to control some soil-borne pathogens. And how that ties in with this slide is that when we recycle grass clippings and we use compost, we can actually have a substrate for these beneficial microorganisms to feed on. Because one of the problems we always have with biological control and helping plants to do better is we got to provide the carbon and the nutrition for many of these beneficial microbes to feed on over a period of time. So that's what compost does. So we're, in the latest research we're doing, we're just finding all those great connections for recycling clippings, for adding compost around all your plants as much as possible, for mulching around trees and shrubs so that you can keep the root systems cooler. You can maintain moisture around those plants. We can reduce weed competition. So we can also use cover crops in gardens as well. But these are all ways that we can help to decrease stress on plants and increase that beneficial microbial relationship with those plants. And here we see some different methodologies for recycling compost. Somebody's actually spreading it right on the lawn. We can put 2 or 3 inches in our vegetable gardens early in the season and then even top dress around plants with compost. And if we use the season before, we can even bring in manures, but we want to give those one season to break down or use composted manures. These are all good sources of micronutrients, but especially organic matter. And the nice thing about these use of compost and other types of organics is that they help us to increase these beneficial microbes and actually retain nutrients and moisture around those root systems. So it really provides that ideal relationship. So if we're trying to reduce problems and stress around plants, we need to make a habit of using compost. So we talked last week about, or the last time we got together, right plant, right place, matching the sunlight, shade, soil, pH, moisture conditions for the plant, extremely important. And once we do that, there's a better chance that we're going to have that plant operate under optimal conditions and to stay healthy for as long as its mature life. And we had just finished up, I think, on spider mite control last time. Someone had started asking about that. In the past couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot of spider mites due to heat stress and other issues. So some things you can do in a small scenario, if you got a small garden, use forceful streams of water. We can use insecticidal soaps that are labeled to control spider mites on that particular species. If you are going organic, you can use OMRI-approved materials. And OMRI, OMRI, stands for Organic Materials Research Institute. And you want to look at products and follow the label very specifically. You have to follow the label. That's the law. And in some times of the year when it's not too hot, we can use horticultural oils. And you would use the summer type oils, but you really got to match it to the temperatures outside and specifically to the plants and the pests that you're trying to control. Another thing that we can use is hot pepper sprays that contain capsaicin. And capsaicin can actually give us control of many soft-bodied insects in a natural way. And in small gardens, a lot of times, if we can control these problems from the beginning and we don't let them get as bad as we see in this slide, then we can get better control.
One thing, Bill, I would add with that is you have to be careful in maintaining the population of predator mites, you know.
Right.
I had used neem and I used other horticultural oils, and I wasn't satisfied with the control that I got, so I used stronger materials, some synthetic pyrethroids, and a few other things. However, in the long run, I ended up making the problem worse than if I sprayed nothing, because I killed the predator mites, and the spider mites, two-spotted, became dominant and took over the plants. So that you can create problems sometimes much more than you think you're controlling them. That's
a really important point, Ray, because we've seen gardeners of all stages do that, and in the integrated pest management program, it really presents a problem because if we kill our predators, then we don't have any competition. So then once the spray goes away, the predator comes back even more vengeful and can kind of take over the entire crop. So trying to find that balance of control, trying to control in the beginning stages, and as much as you can, use biological controls. But catching things in the early stage, whether it be a disease or insect, is really critical if you want adequate control. And then I know, Bill, you were farming, and I know you really tried to use row covers a lot to keep these pests off. You want to just give us a little bit insight on that, how you were keeping these guys away?
Yeah, that's right. So the floating row covers, Rime or Agribon materials, they create a physical barrier between the plant and the insect pest. And so it's one of the safest things that we can do in terms of preserving beneficial insects, because we're just creating the physical barrier. We're not, risking harming them with anything that we're spraying. But one of the things that's really important with using any row covers is making sure that there's no gaps So it has to go on right away before the pest population can develop on your plants. And it has to be completely covered and tight to the soil and no holes in it, because something like spider mites or flea beetles are very small and they'll find a way in. And if you put the row cover on top of the plants after the pest is already there, then you've just basically put a little habitat together for them and they're trapped inside there. So you have to get it on early and make sure that there are no gaps for using the row covers.
And when you lock them in there, they're protected. So we got a nice little microenvironment.
Absolutely. You don't see them as much because they're covered up, so you won't see the damage, and they'll just be feeding and having a great time in there at the expense of your plants.
So what do you guys think's going on here?
Colorado potato beetle.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
Colorado potato beetle, it's coming in right now. We've actually been seeing it out in the fields at all the stages, and trying to get this guy early is really important. Destroying the egg masses when you see them on the underside of leaves, catching the immature stages and removing them. If you have birds in the area, the birds will come in and help you control, but it's usually not enough when these guys get in a very high population. In California, even in some areas, they have severe problems with this on their vegetables, and they put down extra mulch so that when the overwintering population tries to crawl through the mulch, they actually wear themselves out before they even get to the plant. But, they can become real problematic on eggplant, potatoes, peppers, anything in the solanaceous family. They can become extremely problematic. So these guys overwinter, they lay eggs on the plants, but they overwinter in the soil. And the larvae are going to feed on the leaves, and larval stages, what I just showed you, there are actually 2 generations in New Jersey. So we get a lot of these Colorado potato beetles coming in. And over the years, I know Ray and I and Bill have used many different products, and they can become resistant to those products very rapidly because of the resistance that these insects exhibit, and also the fact that they can reproduce so quickly. So what we tend to do is use a combination strategy of different controls because they are resistant to many of the pesticides that are out there.
One thing with the potato beetle, Bill, too, is they have a definite preference in their food sources. And if you have eggplants, they're going to be attacking them first. Then they'll move to tomatoes, then they'll move to other things. They have a definite preference.
And if you have potatoes, definitely hit those.
Potatoes too, yeah.
They love eggplant.
Eggplant, exactly.
If we grow eggplant anywhere, they're the first. You're right, absolutely right. They're the first to be attacked. And it's almost as if you can control them on the eggplant, then you can control them from.
Get rid of them, right?
So it'd be almost like a trap crop that you would use at the edges. So if you have a small garden and as you start to see them, you can hand pick them off. As I mentioned before, in some states they use heavy mulches for the overwintering stages. Bill Erickson had mentioned floating row cover, but you got to make sure that you completely cover the plants to keep them away. And then there's certain BT strains that you can use on the small larvae, and then the pyrethrums you can use. And they can be very effective.
Somebody has a question about the application of diatomaceous earth. Using diatomaceous earth and the effects of that, let's see, to improve soil quality.
Not so much to improve soil quality, but the diatoms are going to, any soft-bodied insect that crawls across it, if it's a larval stage or other type of soft-bodied insect, it's going to cut into the insect and dehydrate the insect, and it will die. So typically we use diatoms near the base of the plants and spread them around it. You can also use extremely coarse sand. Coarse sand will have the same effect on insects because the coarse sand has jagged edges to it. So that's not the smooth sand that you sometimes see, but it's a very large particle size. Sometimes we have to use a combination of different things to actually get a control on Colorado potato beetle, because if it's a particularly bad year, one system or one methodology doesn't necessarily work. So that's really what IPM and a lot of the strategies that our farmers and master gardeners use. They use a combination of different methodologies to control. And then for flea beetle, we used floating row covers like Bill was talking about earlier. We use crop rotation. We try not to grow crops in the same area 2 years in a row. And we use hot pepper wax sprays because they're sensitive to the capsaicin in the hot pepper wax. So those are some things that you can use. And flea beetles are very common on many of our vegetable plants, and you see the damage that they're doing right here. So you see this characteristic feeding damage here, and then you see the little black beetles. That's exactly what we have. So here's two methods for controlling them. And what do you suppose is happening here? Ray, you got any ideas?
Borers.
Yep, you got it. Squash vine borer. Adult clearing moth. The eggs are laid on the stalks in the early part of the season, and then these borers will actually tunnel into the stem. They overwinter as a cocoon inside. Typically, we don't have a lot of these necessarily in the commercial agricultural production. You see them more in gardens, but they can be problematic anywhere if we get a high population of them.
The one problem with them, Bill, is that once you see the damage, there's nothing you can really do about it.
Too late.
It's already
Exactly.
inside of it, and it's protected, and the
Right.
sprays and other things will not control it.
Well, you're absolutely right, because if you look here, you can see that this little bugger, the borer itself, is inside of the plant, and it's feeding away, creating all this frass inside. So, you know, there really isn't an effective way to get in there once the insect is in there. So one of the things you can do is early in the season, you can use those floating row covers once again. And then when the plant starts to flower and it goes into its second flower stage, you can remove those row covers, because by that time we're getting a little bit beyond when they're laying their eggs. So by delaying planting, that can sometimes help. And destroying what you see. Some people will actually do an injection of BT, but I don't know too many people that are going to go out there and inject BT into their plants. I know I'm not. But that's one option that you have. Bill, do you have any other methodologies that you used when you were farming?
You know, I would just say one thing in general, too, is to just try to grow as healthy a plant as you can to start with. You know, try to reduce any stress on the plant, give them the right moisture, get the soil fertility correct, and a healthier plant is going to be better able to resist some of these attacks and to sort of grow through it if there is a little bit of damage. So I think the combination approach, having some of these, you know, options available, but really just trying to keep the, you know, health of the plant optimized can really help with this as well.
Whitefly control, same thing. We're going to use the floating row covers. Be careful with the insecticidal soap, especially if it's really hot outside. We can cause damage, so you really got to read that label. Certain pyrethroids and pyrethrums can have good effects. You can also use some of the products like neem oil, which can be effective with whiteflies. Usually you bring whiteflies out into your garden from the greenhouse, because whiteflies do not overwinter in our area. That is if we have a cold enough winter. So typically if we clean up the trash around the plants in the garden, then we'll get pretty good control of whiteflies. Otherwise, we'll see a lot of sucking damage, and the plants will start to deteriorate if we get excessive whitefly populations. Aphids, the same thing, you know, using forceful water. Sometimes we can use a foil mulch around the plants where the aphids will fly in, and then they see the reflection of the light, and then they actually fly away from the plant. So in some cases, foil mulches will work directly around the plant. We can use insecticidal soaps. Be careful, as I mentioned before, about the heat index on insecticidal soaps, and that it's cleared for that specific plant and that pest on the plant at that time. Azadirachtin or neem oil. Azadirachtin is the active compound isolated from Azadirachta indica tree, which is called Nemex in some cases. That can be used, and you really want to follow the guidelines, follow the label. There are many beneficials out there that will help us to control a lot of these soft-bodied insects, including ladybird beetles, lacewings, green and brown type lacewings, and aphid midges as well. So these are some methodologies that we can utilize within the garden. And whenever you're looking for these pests, notice here, we're not looking on the top side of the leaf, but we're looking below the leaf to see where the damage is. So sometimes when people make a mistake when they're investigating their garden, they really don't look under the leaf, and that's where these problems become. The reason they hide under there is they're protected from the excessive sunlight. They're protected from predators. It's nice and cool under there, and they can hang out and have a party and just kind of munch down and have a festival under there. So that's why you got to look. Some of the plants that we, Rich and I and others have worked with Dr. George Hamilton in the past out at our location, looking at plants that attract beneficials, and these were the top plants that we found in the studies that we did, that, dill and bronze fennel and coriander and buckwheat, alyssums, and sunflowers, cosmos, basil. These were all great plants for bringing in beneficial insects, including taconid wasp and many of the other species that will actually help us to maintain a high level of beneficial insects within the area to give us some control. So if you have a nice small garden and you're growing these plants in and around the plants within the garden, you can attract these beneficials in, provide them with a little bit of water, in containers, and replace that water once in a while. They will hide out under the leaves of some of these larger plants and actually provide protection from some of the insects that are attacking our plants. Have you guys utilized any of these beneficial plants in your production systems? Ray.
Yeah, I think these plants are great because they are sort of serve multiple purposes. So they can be, they're beneficial insect attracting plants, but they're also a marketable crop, whether you're looking at some of the herbs here or some of the other flowers, and there's cut flowers. So there's sort of this dual benefit, or buckwheat for building soil. So they're not only bringing in beneficial insects, but they have, these multiple functions. So yeah, we've grown all these plants in some form or another on our farm. Yeah, so the next few slides are some common problems that we see on some very common landscape plants. So the first one is rose, and many people grow rose. It's a super common, Jersey Shore classic plant, and in many areas. But one of the most common problems that we see on rose is black spot. And so you can see it's called black spot because it starts out as black spots on the leaves. And they turn yellow on the leaves, and the leaves eventually fall off. And so this can cause a problem. This is actually a fungus, and it spreads by splashing spores. So it needs moisture to spread and to survive and to thrive. So shady, wet conditions are going to favor this fungus. Eventually the infected leaves are going to fall off of the plant, and that can be damaging. It's not only unsightly, but that's going to reduce the amount of photosynthesis from the rose and reduce the amount of energy that the plant has. So this can be damaging to the plant. So increasing airflow through pruning and not planting too close to one another or too close to other plants, making sure it's getting enough sunlight and it's not shaded. All of those things can help. And then also removing the diseased leaves. So either pruning them out and also raking them up in the fall, because the spores can survive on the infected leaves that fall off, and then that just becomes the next batch that's going to reinfect the rose. So this is what we refer to as good sanitation, just cleaning up after the plant and trying to remove it from the system. One of the first things we can really do, though, is to choose resistant cultivars, and that holds true for just about every plant. Whereas if the plant is not susceptible to the disease, then it's not going to get it, or it's going to be much less severe than a susceptible cultivar. So there are many roses now that are bred to be black spot resistant because it is such a problem. So starting out with good genetic material is sort of the first thing we can do. Along the lines of reducing leaf wetness, we want to avoid overhead irrigation, so trying to keep those leaves dry because that's going to help the fungus to survive. So using drip irrigation, or if you are irrigating by hand or with a hose, doing so early in the day so that it can dry out quickly when the sun comes out. So if you water at night and you get the leaves wet, they're going to remain wet all throughout the night. So that's a longer period of time that the environmental conditions are favoring the fungus. So trying to keep those leaves dry one way or another. And then there are fungicides that are available to treat this. So copper sulfate being an organic fungicide, or chlorothalonil is another option. But trying to really focus on some of those cultural practices first can really reduce the problem to start with.
One comment I wanted to add to, Bill, was the fact, and it's true of all the commodities, but with fungicides, it's important that people understand they're basically preventative materials. In other words, once you see the disease, it's almost too late. I'm not saying almost too late, not totally, but you're much more effective if you start before you have the problem. So it's an issue there, I think, of knowing the conditions you have and that you perennially have a problem with it. You have to start a program early and you can prevent it.
That's a great point, Ray, and that's super important. It's sort of, a lot of the work that we can do for our plants now and early in the spring next year are going to sort of, affect us further down the line. So now we can be pruning the roses, raking up any diseased leaves, and then early in the spring, before we even see problems, you can start the preventative fungicides if you know you're going to have a problem. And then maybe after several seasons of good control, you can sort of, reduce those practices. But if you have a problem, it can take some time to get it under control, for sure. So while we're still on the topic of roses, we have another very common insect pest that not only affects roses, but these are Japanese beetles, and they can affect many, many different species of plants. They will damage roses. It's largely cosmetic damage that they're going to do to roses, but as they're chewing on the plant, they're creating wounds on the plant that can cause it to dry out or be a future source of infection where another pathogen can get in. And as the leaves are defoliated, it's going to reduce photosynthesis as well. So this can cause some real problems. And fun fact, Japanese beetles first arrived in the U.S. in New Jersey. So in 1916, before that, really, insect pest was not in the United States, but it came to New Jersey on the roots of irises that came from Japan. So it's a fun Japanese beetle fact about New Jersey. So we have two life cycle.
Bill, did they arrive coach or first class?
That's a good question. We have two different life cycles that can actually do damage to the plant here. So we see the adult Japanese beetle that, just about this time of the year, we can expect to find them in the garden. But then the white grubs are the juveniles, and those are underground, and they can be feeding on the roots, doing damage. And so these are the same insects. There are many kinds of grubs that can damage plants, but one of them pertains to the Japanese beetle. And when we look at the figure here, we can see sort of the life cycle of the Japanese beetle, where, now, June, July, the adults have emerged and they're feeding on the above ground portions of the plant, but the juvenile is doing damage to the roots underground, and you might not even see that damage, but the plant is going to be stressed from it. So, again, thinking about next year, if we want to reduce our Japanese beetle populations for next year, we can start to address the white grub population in their juvenile stages. So the adults are going to lay their eggs, and then soon, probably, in July, mid-July or so, underground, the eggs are going to hatch. And this is going to be the juvenile white grub. And so pretty much July through September is going to be the best time to treat the soil to control the grubs, because they're in their youngest juvenile stage and they're most vulnerable. So a lot of the times getting these insect pests, addressing them when they're in this young juvenile stage is going to be the most effective way to control them. So treating July through September, and there are several different options. There's parasitic nematodes, milky spore bacteria or certain strains of BT that will target these white grub populations. And so if we can reduce those, there will be less adult Japanese beetles to emerge next year in the summer. Now, when we want to deal with the adult beetles, hand picking is one thing that we can do, a laborious process. There are several low-risk insecticides that are effective as well. But you may see these Japanese beetle pheromone traps. We would not recommend those as being effective. They will attract beetles. So it's a bag that has a lure, and the Japanese beetles go to it and they get trapped in it. But you're basically creating a Japanese beetle party in your yard. You're going to attract them from your neighbor's yard and from other fields and everything. And so research has shown that this is not necessarily effective in reducing full populations of the pests. It just draws them from far away. So, yeah, I don't know if you guys have anything more to add on Japanese beetles or their pheromone traps.
Just a few things. One is that we've had some pretty good luck with parasitic nematodes. They usually come in a sponge or they come packaged in a cold container because they're not encapsulated, so they won't last long. So you order them right before you're getting ready to use them in July or August. And then you actually put them in a container where you can actually spray them with a spray-on hose, and you would do it late in the day and apply them, and then water them in so that they can actually swim down, and then they actually swim into the spiracles of the Japanese beetle, and they actually will inject a bacteria inside of the Japanese beetle or the white grub complex in general, and they will explode the grub. Milky spore bacteria are very effective against Japanese beetles, but not necessarily that effective against some of the other types of beetles that are out there on the white grub population. They have had good luck with the BTs, applying them at the right time at the early stages. And you're right, those traps are not effective. I'd recommend you if anybody puts up a trap, put it far away from your yard to attract the beetles away from your location. So I usually put them in Ray Samuelis's yard, but not in my yard.
Yes, it's for your friends and neighbors, not for your own thing. I one time did a television show on that, and we had to cancel the interview right in the middle of the show because we got invaded and attacked by beetles out at the Burlington County College. They got in our eyes and our hair and everything else, so they can be tough. One thing I wanted to add to this discussion, too, is the fact that grubs, it's important to try to do something about them for another totally different reason, and that is the accessory problem of moles. Okay, moles in the lawn and in your garden, they're one of my number one problems of my own property, and I've used many poisons, I've used many traps, I've used repellents, I've used you name it. Now, the problem, too, with controlling them in order to get rid of the moles is the fact that moles also love earthworms. So you have a dichotomy. You want to get rid of the grubs, but you don't want to get rid of the earthworms. So it's very much a challenge, and one I think that goes on and continues on.
It's good points, Ray. So, we typically will use a combination of these methods in different landscapes. But what we have found, and I know Albert Koppenhofer at Rutgers has been doing quite a bit of work on this, and if we have actively growing turf that's growing, like if you take our turf class that we're going to provide a little bit later in Are You Ready to Garden and within our Master Gardener programs, we talk about how to get turf to grow at such a rapid state and using methodologies that really just keeps the turf super healthy, that many times it can outlive a lot of these insect invaders and still do well because the root systems will outgrow. But if we reach anywhere from 8 to 10 or more per square foot, then we may need to take action because that's usually our threshold for the white grub complex. But we find that if we're growing turf optimal, when we're growing great varieties with deep roots, they can sometimes withstand even much higher populations and still do fine. So there, in that case, you wouldn't even need to reach for any pesticide. You would just need to use good turf genetics and good management practices. Go ahead, Bill.
Before we move on, going back to roses, There's questions about forever roses, about, I guess, their ability to reduce black spot problems and probably maybe some other problems. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, there's several, cultivars and marketed different brands of roses that have black spot resistance, and some of them are more effective than others, and I think it also you still want to plant them in the right environment. So, sunnier, dry environments are still going to do better. Yeah, and some roses have some degree of black spot resistance, where it might reduce the amount of disease damage, but in the wrong situation, they could still potentially get it. So yeah, they're definitely black spot resistant cultivars, and I would highly recommend going with those for lower maintenance for sure.
Thank you.
As a plant pathologist too, one of the things we all learn is that even resistance is a relative term, that if a plant is under stress, it may have quite a bit of resistance against something, but under stress, that resistance can be lowered. And I know, Ray, you've probably seen that on farms throughout the years too, where we have a resistant variety, what we think is resistant, but then in a stressful year, it can succumb to disease and insect problems. That's
correct. Yeah, that type of thing happens a lot. You factor in nematodes and other problems that are less visible, the overall effect changes. And when they say resistant, it's not the same as immune. People think it means they're not going to get it at all. It doesn't mean that. There's no such thing as 100%, immunity.
Here's another really common landscape plant, lilacs. Many of us have these, and something that we're going to start to see as the nights start to turn a little bit cooler, as we get a little bit later in the summer, is powdery mildew showing up on the lilacs. So this is another fungus, but this is sort of more cosmetic damage. So this is really common, might look unsightly, but it's not going to kill the lilac plant. And there are many plants that can get powdery mildew, so you might see this on your squash as well, but this is actually a different species of the fungus. So it's a different kind of powdery mildew that's going to affect your lilac versus your pumpkins. But with that in mind, it's the same kind of conditions that are going to encourage it on one plant and the other. So again, one of the first things we can do is to start with resistant cultivars if you're planting new lilacs. But I know many households and gardens have sort of older classic lilacs that have been there for many years. And so trying to increase airflow and sunlight. So after the lilacs have bloomed, that can be a good time to prune them, take out any diseased or dead branches or branches that are restricting airflow or shading out other ones. It's a good way to sort of open things up and allow more sunlight and airflow to come through. And you want to also try not to overcrowd them too close to one another or too close to other plants. Good practice to just allow more light and airflow and reduce the prospects that the fungus will take hold. Good sanitation again, raking up the leaves and removing them. So these are ways that we can try to reduce the populations for the future. There are fungicides, but generally not recommended and not usually sprayed. Again, like Ray was saying, preventative is way more effective than curative. So once you see this on the plant already, it's a little bit late to try to address what's currently on the leaves. You might slow the spread, but doing something preventative before it starts to show up is going to reduce the chance that it's even going to, really come out on the leaves. But again, this is more of a cosmetic issue, so it's just, what your personal aesthetic threshold would be. But we see this every year, and really common on lilacs. This next one, boxwood blight. This is a fairly new problem that we're starting to see in New Jersey, and it's really causing, it can cause a lot of trouble, serious rapid defoliation of boxwood plants. So boxwood are planted everywhere, really common residential and commercial landscape plants. And this is caused by another fungus. So, we've been talking about this common concept in fungi. They like wet conditions, they like reduced airflow, and so this is what is going to encourage this fungus on boxwood as well. So wet locations are not going to be favorable to these plants, and this is easily transported from nurseries who have infected plants and may not even know it. So a new boxwood planting that's going in could spread this into your yard. And so it starts out as dark lesions on the stem, usually on the bottom of the plant, and it can spread up the plant very quickly, especially with soil or water splashing up from the soil, heavy rains, things like that. So nurseries are aware of this, and they have a boxwood blight compliance program to make sure that they certify the plants don't have it. There's research being conducted throughout the United States, really, on resistant cultivars to see how resistant they actually are and how that differs from one region to the next. Boxwoods also are often sheared with hedge trimmers into different shapes or just maintained at certain sizes, and this is a really prime way to spread the boxwood blight, especially if they're sheared when it's wet. So if you have the fungus present and you have spores and you have wet weather and you take mechanical hedge trimmers and create many wounds in the plant and distribute the water and the spores throughout the plant, you can spread it very quickly from one plant, from an infected plant to a healthy plant.
Bill, we have a question from Sandy asking, will wood chips help against the boxwood blight?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, they can help. So that's going to reduce splash up of spores from the soil, and it's going to sort of provide a better cover, and it's going to prevent the spores from getting up into the lower parts of the plant and moving up. So yes, wood chip mulch can help. We'll see coming up very soon proper ways to mulch. So you want to make sure that you're not mulching up the stem of the plant. Covering the roots and covering the soil is good, but you want to make sure you're also not moving the mulch up the stem of the plant, because that can create more problems and create moisture on the stem if the mulch is touching it. So yeah, mulch along the ground is a good cultural practice to help with this and with many other diseases. And like we had mentioned with some of the other diseases like black spot on rose, when you have leaves that have fallen off from the infected plants, you want to remove these from the site. So you can bag them up and put them in the trash or burn them, but you don't want to put them through your compost pile because that can just proliferate the fungus, and you don't want to leave them or necessarily mulch on top of them. You want to get them out of the site. So something to think about too are areas that have these large historic boxwoods, or if you have boxwoods on your property that have been there forever and you're really attached to them, you want to be careful about buying in new boxwood plants from an unknown source, especially because you could be introducing this fungus into your property. And once it's there, it's really hard to get rid of, if not impossible. They'll have to dig up the plant and the soil on site to really get rid of it. So if you have a healthy site and historic, nice boxwood plants, you want to be really careful about introducing anything else into their vicinity that could potentially be infected. So this is a big area of research and of concern in the nursery industry right now.
Bill, there was a question on boxwoods about replanting, and I had just done a quick answer, and I said it's probably not a good idea to put boxwoods back in the same location, because if you have a disease buildup in that area, you might want to consider another type of plant for that location. So with some plant diseases, more than others, if the disease is virulent enough and lasts long enough, and is persistent within that area, what you had talked about in terms of raking up all the leaves before, making sure you adequately clean up any of the diseased tissue in that area, I think that's really important to prevent further spread, and then also looking at alternative species if you can.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And this is one particular disease that can persist in the soil. So replanting on this one is a little bit more risky. If you replant another boxwood in the same place, even if you get rid of the diseased plant, there's a good chance that that fungus is still persisting. If you had a resistant cultivar, that might be better, but again, it still could get it. So planting something else or planting boxwoods in a different location would be, I would think, the recommendation if the disease has shown up.
The interesting thing about this, Ray, I'm going to bring Ray Samuels in. Ray, we always thought boxwoods were pretty much a bulletproof plant in the old days. We didn't see much problems with them.
I would say this problem is definitely a newer problem. And
yeah,
as Bill mentioned earlier, I have it on my own property, and I purchased a couple plants, and won't mention a company, but it was not a local nursery, and I had no idea where the plants came from. Now, all the other ones have it too. So, like you said, I basically inoculated them, by bringing in the plants from a less than reputable source, obviously.
Another replacement type of plant that looks similar. Some of the hollies can look similar to some of the boxwood types too.
Ilex crenata convex.
Replacement.
And even Ilex crenata convex is a good one too, right, for replacement?
Yeah.
Could be one.
Yeah, there's so many. There's hundreds of varieties of hollies to choose from. So, but that's, if you want a leaf size, leaf shape similar to that, there are a lot of hollies out there that can be used.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rich. There are, many other plants that can fulfill a very similar function in your yard and have a similar aesthetic that don't necessarily have the same problems. So, yeah, great point on plant selection, right plant for the right site if you're having a problem with this. This is another pest on some common plants that we have. So arborvitaes, Leland cypress, very common border plantings, privacy screens, and also other conifers and deciduous plants. And so you might see this little brown sort of pine cone looking structure on some of these conifers, and you might think it's a pine cone or a cypress cone, but it's not. So this is a bagworm. So this is an insect pest, and it has kind of an interesting life cycle. It will actually create these bag structures. So the bagworms, they're a little caterpillar. They may be 1.5 to 2 inches long, and they overwinter in these bags, and then they hatch out in the spring, late May, early June, and they begin to feed. And so we can see on the lower picture, you can see this little browning of the tips of the arborvitae that we're looking at there, and that might even look like abiotic stress, could be drought stress or something. So that's the very beginning of the feeding damage of the bagworm caterpillar. So it's sort of the first sign that you might see that you have them. So as they're feeding, they're going to start to build these bags for protection. It's like this little house that they're building to protect themselves. And then in the fall, they'll mate and they'll lay eggs in the bag, and the eggs will overwinter, and the next generation will come out the next year. And so what we can do is, for this year, to again try to reduce the population before they come out next year. So right now, there are insecticides, BT in particular, Bacillus thuringiensis. There are strains that are effective against the bagworm, and now is a good time that they can still be applied. So when the caterpillars are still young, there are some of these sort of low toxicity insecticides that can be effective. But once they form their bags, it can be a little bit more difficult to control by that measure. So they can be removed by hand. If you see the bags, you can pick them off. And that can occur, October through the winter. So you can be continuing to try to remove these from your yard, through the fall, because they'll have the eggs in them at that time, and they won't be hatching to the spring. They'll be visible, so you can get out and do that. But each of these bags can contain over 300 eggs. So you can see how this problem can spread very quickly and really move through your plants exponentially each year. Any of you guys have bagworms on your farm or garden?
Every year.
Every year, yep.
My dad used to have them every year in a spruce. And one time they basically killed the top of the spruce out, so it became more of a bush versus a tree. But yeah, they're pretty nasty if you don't watch and take care of it. But you can easily pull them off if you're dealing with a few, so that's what I try to do.
Yeah, we try to pull them off, but if you have a large plant, it becomes problematic.
As a kid, I used to like to pull them off and step on them, see the green stuff come out of them. So
yeah,
Rich, you know how to have
for the summer.
You know how to have fun, Rich. I'll tell you.
yeah. Are we going to discuss hemlocks at all?
Do you have a hemlock slide, Bill?
Like one of the insects that I have a lot of problems with in recent years is hemlock adelgia.
Woolly adelgia, yep. That's a very big problem.
But I have 50, 60-foot trees. But the beauty of it is you can use imidacloprid as a drench alongside the trunk. And you don't have to spray the whole thing. Like 10 years ago, you had to hire a guy to spray up that. It cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. This way, mix it in a 5-gallon pail, drench it around the trunk, systemic material. And I just checked mine the other day. They're still on there, but there's nothing there. They're dead. They're just skeletons left. So it works good.
And that is very effective. It's a neonic. It's basically absorbed into the plant itself and affects the entire tree. So it gives a protection over a period of time. So that is one good option for that. And that's become a real problem in hemlocks all throughout the state of New Jersey. We're seeing woolly adelgia is a very serious problem. You got to stay.
Property in New York State, a lot of the hemlocks have died because of that too.
It's a shame because I love hemlocks. They're such a wonderful tree. They're just such a graceful plant.
Yeah, we had a lot of hemlocks in the forests up in Maine and New Hampshire, so it is a really nice tree. All right, keeping on the topic of trees, the next one is borers, and this is sort of a general term. There are many species of borers, and they're just the larval stages of several moths and beetles. So there's several different ones that can be affecting your trees, and they can affect many different species of trees as well. And so what happens is the moths and beetles lay their eggs in the tree, and then the larval stages bore through the inner bark and damage the tree. And you might not even see the damage until, as the picture is showing, we see defoliation, thinning of the canopy, and we can't find any insects on the leaves or the stems or anything, but the damage is actually coming from the borers damaging the inner bark and disrupting the conductive tissues of the tree. So it can't get water, it can't get nutrients out to the leaves, it can't get sugars coming back down from the leaves, and so it starts to drop leaves and branches start to die from this internal problem. So one thing that's interesting about this is that borers are usually attracted to stressed plants. So healthy plants are generally not as susceptible to borers, and so these can be many different abiotic stresses, whether it's drought or heat or waterlogged soil, soil compaction, physical damage, so maybe a mower ran over the roots or something damaged the lower bark. But some of these initial stresses can weaken the tree and sort of send out chemical signals, that stress signals from the plant that beetles and moths can pick up on, and they see that this is a weakened tree that could be a suitable habitat to lay their eggs and for borers to, infest.
Yeah,
So,
one plant that has a severe problem with borers is, of course, the emerald ash borer. I have one in my property, in my backyard, that's the circumference, I think, is 34 inches. So it's a pretty big tree. And I'm having good results with it. I'm very pleased. Last year, I decided to go high tech and utilize the Mildew injection system. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It was little capsules or little round discs with a little tip to it full of imidacloprid. You drilled around the tree and got it into the cambium layer, sucked it up. And within 3-4 minutes, it sucked up the entire container, up 25 of these containers up to the top of the tree. This year, I did a drench with it, and I'm going to knock on wood. I would say the tree has probably 50% more leaves than it did the last 10 years. So I think I'm getting some results. And not, realistically, I don't think I'm going to totally save the tree, but if I can keep it alive for even 2 or 3 or 4 more years, I'll be very happy with that.
that's excellent. And you did the injections yourself, Ray?
Correct, yeah. I just had to get a drill, and it was a little bit of a challenge to get it the right depth, and they explained how to do that, and it had like a pointed tip. You just had to get the certain size drill, stuck it in there, and it was a round disc, and like I was surprised, literally, I would say in 3 or 4 minutes, the tree had sucked up all 20 of them. Then you pull them out, and that's the end of it. Yeah, it worked good.
Thanks. And then I'll also mention, too, if you have, large shade trees and specimen trees that you want to preserve, there are also, you can hire licensed arborists, and there are lists of folks who are licensed arborists who are certified in plant health diagnostics and insect and disease control. So if it's something that you feel more comfortable having a professional come out, we have those skilled professionals all throughout the state of New Jersey. And again, like other problems as well, trying to reduce some of these stressors and improving the plant health, try to get them, back on track, reduce the likelihood that they're going to get infected in the first place, pruning out dead branches if they are completely dead, and just, trying to keep the trees as healthy as possible. So this next problem, this is really common that we see, and it's not necessarily one disease or so. It's kind of a human-imposed problem onto plants, and this is over-mulching, or sometimes referred to as the mulch volcano. And we see this everywhere. And once you start to look for this, you'll see it even more if you look at landscaping and people's yards or commercial applications as well. And so what's happening here is that the mulch is piled too high up the stem of the plant. And so the stem, or the trunk of the tree, that needs to remain above ground. And when you mulch it, you're basically putting it underground. So the roots should be covered. Mulch is great to conserve moisture underground, reduce weed pressure, add organic matter, slow release of nutrients, add carbon to the soil. There's many benefits of mulch, but they don't belong around the stem of a tree. So this can starve plant for oxygen, can cause the inner bark to die back, which invites disease organisms to come in. This can also invite borers or other insects. It can create too much heat, so especially as mulch is decomposing, it's going to generate heat, and this can damage the bark. And it can also create pH imbalances or nitrogen deficiencies if done improperly. So the bottom picture, you can see, very extreme case. This was a very large, fairly large diameter tree, and it rotted away because the mulch was too high up the base of the tree.
Another thing with them, Bill, is that the mulch, you're putting mulch on generally to conserve moisture and to keep the moisture in the roots. But when you get it as thick as your picture shows there, it's counterproductive because the rain will never penetrate it. You're actually making it drier, and you're not, the moisture cannot get down to the roots. So that's bad.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So if you think about that mulch as a sponge, and if it dries out and the rain falls on it, then all that mulch has to be hydrated by the rain first before it even gets down to the roots, if at all. And so they've sort of created this problem that was unnecessary.
This is a real problem in landscapes throughout New Jersey, where if we have somebody either starting out or somebody that's improperly trained in mulching, they think a little is good and more is better. And like Ray was saying, you will actually cut off and starve oxygen and water to the base of that plant, to the roots. And we've seen many a tree die out from over mulching. And in some cases, we've had to go out to landscapes, and I've told the landscape professionals, you've got to go back in, you got to remove all this because you're going to kill these trees. And sure enough, they went in and they did save the trees by doing that. So it's very important to know the depth of that. Just a few inches is all you need.
Well, it's interesting, too, because I know people would call me and, about problems with trees. And one of the things, if you build a new house by a builder or whomever in the woods and all, they regrade the land and change the grade, sometimes the people are very shrewd because they'll guarantee it for 1 year. Well, the tree's not going to die in 1 year. It's going to die the next year.
Right.
So it's like, but you can kill trees very easily by even changing the grade 3 or 4 inches. And that's what this mulch does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're almost so accustomed to seeing this that...
Yeah, right, it's normal, yeah.
Yeah, that this is how it's supposed to look. This is because you see it so often that it might be like, oh, this is correct. I want it to look like that. But it's very unhealthy for the tree. So here's just an example of more correct application of mulch. And like we said, there are many benefits to mulching properly. So if you think about the forest floor, it's covered in mulch, it's covered in leaves, sticks, and wood, but it's on the floor. It's covering the roots of the plant and not for the 1 to 2 inches, not burying the trunk. Keeping it away from the base of the tree is better than right up against the base. So want to avoid the mulch volcano. And so now keep an eye out when you're driving around or you're walking around. Look for these mulch volcanoes. I bet you'll see quite a few of them.
Thing is to make sure that, like Bill says, you need to pull back that mulch right from the base of the tree because, especially in the wintertime, you'll have rabbits and other animals that, because it's so close, they will get up very close to the tree because they don't have any predators, and they just go in and they start munching on the base of that tree. And if they eat an entire circumference of that tree and they destroy the phloem and xylem, you're not going to have the tree is going to die because you don't have any transmission of water or nutrients. So it's really important to pull that back. Also, it keeps certain pest problems at bay as well by keeping that mulch back a little bit. The biggest things we see is problems with wet areas. And unless we can control flooding, if we have water sitting in an area for days on end, it's very difficult to grow any crop, whether it be turf grass, whether it be trees and shrubs, unless they're highly adapted to wet areas or wetlands. So one of the key things, when I moved into our neighborhood here, I realized that, we had some challenges here with wet soils. So we had to set up adequate drainage and do some grading around the property so that we had a nice, 3 to 5% slope away from the property on all sides. And we didn't have water coming in towards our basement. We didn't have water gathering around some key plants within the landscape. So the more that you can control and manage excess amounts of water and provide adequate drainage for plants, the wider selection of plants you'll be able to grow. And in some areas where we have a lot of water problems, then you could turn to plants that are adapted to those conditions, or you could create raised beds in those areas, or you can go in and modify. And typically you'll have to get a professional to come in and help you set up drainage systems, underground drainage systems, where you can take that water away from that area and have adequate oxygen and going to those root systems. So there's a lot of options that you have, some more economical than others, depending on your situation. But there are plants that, and if you go onto our website, we'll give you a list of plants that are adapted to wet conditions. For instance, in our area where we've got some issues like this, we have willow oaks growing, we have inkberry growing, and some other plants that can tolerate those wetter conditions and still thrive under those conditions. But there's not going to be a real long list of plants that do well. Turf does not like wet conditions. And if you have water problems in an area, you need to alleviate those wet areas if you're going to try to grow any type of healthy turf grass, because it simply cannot survive where you've got moisture problems like you see here. So it's very...
Well, one other thing that you can do, and I've done this on my own property and many times, but also observed it on farms in a much larger scale, and that is the use of agricultural gypsum. Agricultural gypsum is a byproduct of the, I think it's steel manufacturing, I think. It's calcium sulfate, which is not lime. A lot of people think it looks like lime, you put it on in place of lime. No, it does not change the pH. But what it does do is form soil structure. And if you form soil structure, you can alleviate a lot of moisture problems in the soil. And I can remember farmers, that had 2-acre patches that they had to drive around it with the tractor, put 2 tons of gypsum on it, and all of a sudden the next year they're farming right across it. So it is very effective in helping soil drainage in some cases.
Ray, do you know who first started using gypsum?
No.
I think it was Benjamin Franklin back then.
I did not know that.
Were you good friends with him, or?
Yeah, right.
Okay. No, I just wanted to know.
An acquaintance.
Take a soil test, too?
Yeah.
I think he did, yeah, from what I remember. Another problem that we have that's very serious in a lot of areas where we tend to have heavier soils is compaction. And, a lot of weed problems that we see around the state of New Jersey, weeds are really an indicator that we've got a compaction issue. So just by using herbicides, especially in lawn areas, if we only rely on the herbicide, it may not completely control our problem. We may have underlying issues with severe compaction that will prevent us from having good, top growth of the different types of grass plants and allowing them to penetrate into the soil so they can get the nutrients and water that they need. Especially important now as we all turn towards lower input turf grasses like the fine fescues and the turf-type tall fescues. These plants want to go much deeper into the soil, and they can break up compacted soil to a certain degree, but if the soil is extremely compact and nothing has been done to remediate those soils, those grasses are going to continually struggle. Weeds will actually be a symptom of that problem, but then you really need to go out and do a little bit of digging with a shovel or a trowel. And if you haven't had rain for a while and you get a good rain and you go out there with a trowel, and if you're not able to dig down deep into the soil, then you probably have a compaction problem and you may need to core aerate in the fall of the year is usually the best time. And coming into September is usually our best time in this area to do some core aeration. But if you don't take care of this problem, you will continually have grass plants, turf grass, that will be struggling the whole time. So you'll tend to get more disease problems, more weed problems. So it'll increase your use of pesticides, especially herbicides, in those areas. Plus, we can get more fungal diseases because the plant is under greater stress. So, taking soil tests, going out, looking whether you have a compaction problem in the area, seeing whether or not you can dig down into the soil relatively easily after a good rain. If you can do those things, I call it the screwdriver test too. If you have a good sharp screwdriver and you go out after a rain, you should be able to sink that screwdriver down into the soil quite deeply. And if you can't, that's probably an indicator that you've got some severe compaction problems. Any comments from you guys on that?
No, other than the gypsum, you know, like I said.
Yeah, gypsum is another good alternative. We use gypsum in commercial agriculture, and the calcium sulfate is pretty effective at inocculating and loosening up soils, so you can get good water penetration and air penetration into the.
I had to patch a fairly good sized section of my front lawn because it's sewer root problems. On the front of my property, I believe it's probably a state record American elm tree. It's 13 or 14 feet circumference around the trunk, and the roots, you know, find every little gap and opening in the pipe. So I had to get the pipe replaced. But it rained 4 times the day the guy installed the pipe. So as he drove his equipment back and forth, it compacted it. So I got this soil conditioner, which was a combination of agricultural gypsum and some good organic mulch that I'll incorporate it into it now. I'm reseeding it, and hopefully that'll, you know, make a good environment and, you know, improve the drainage.
Rich, do you see any questions that coming our way that are critical? And get a chance to go through them all.
Why not use wood chips that over time will add compost to the soil and absorb some of the water issue?
The problem with using raw mulch, non-composted, is nitrogen, Rob. When you put it in the soil, it'll remove nitrogen, and you end up with plants that are deficient in nitrogen. You know, and I can remember doing that with peppers and tomatoes and farmers and others. You know, if you compost it, break it down, that problem doesn't occur. But if it's a raw wood chips, it's a different story.
Yeah, we always recommend, we teach a couple of composting classes, and actually we'll be doing one on here in probably about a month from now. But when you compost, you really need to have all the ingredients properly incorporated, and you want to make sure the compost is completely finished, you know, at a final stage of maturation before you actually mix it in with the topsoil. And as Ray said, we had people that did not use mature compost, and it still had the original. You could still identify some of the original components. So what happens is those bacteria and fungi that are feeding around, mostly bacteria, they will actually grab all the nitrogen that they could possibly can to break down that compost, and they take the nitrogen away from your plants, so your vegetable plants start to turn yellow as a result of that. So using finished compost, very good thing. Using unfinished compost mixed in with vegetables, not such a good thing.
Quick, Bill, there's a quick question on some good methods of core aeration for a home garden.
Okay, so core aeration, you can use, there actually are core aerator commercial versions of that. There are other versions that you can either push along, you know, the smaller versions for small lawns that will actually penetrate down. You know, I've seen some of these out there, but the commercial core aerators work a little bit better, and the new ones actually have a drum on them that you can fill with water, and it'll actually bring the cores up to the surface and then roll over top of those and kind of crush them on the surface, but it allows oxygen to penetrate in those areas. And typically after we core aerate, we can top dress with a little bit of fertilizer and also put some organic matter down at that time, and that'll filtrate down through those areas. You can also, just by using, you know, some people will go out with these special spiky shoes and things like that. They will just kind of penetrate through to help break down the thatch and core aerate a little bit. And there are certain types of rakes and devices that you can use that will remove thatch or just kind of help to penetrate down into the soil. But you are going to do damage to the turf at that time, but it's going to bounce back from it. So whenever you core aerate or dethatch in September, which is the best time, you're going to see that it's going to turn brown. It's going to take a little while for that turf grass to bounce back. So that's why we got to keep it irrigated and keep it fertilized directly after we do that, so that it has time for recovery. If you do these things in the fall of the year, especially for your turf grass, you're going to be coming into a cooler part of the season, so the turf grass is going to recover much better, and you'll have better results by doing core aeration at that time of the year. You want to be very careful core aerating around shallow-rooted trees, because you don't want to do damage to trees that have shallow roots with a core aerator, because if we do damage to trees, and some people will prune too heavily around trees too, and they say, oh, we can prune around that tree and put in this structure. Well, when you do that, you can damage the root system and provide an entry area for verticillium or other types of soil fungi to inhabit those root systems and end up causing a problem and eventually killing the tree. So you got to be very careful about where you core aerate and how deep. You want to know how deep those root systems of those plants are going. Any comments from you guys on that? And Ray, you see here that this person had an elephant problem in their area. We have repellents that we use, so we typically don't have that problem.
Yeah. That's one animal I haven't had a problem with. That's probably the only one.
Yeah, probably the only one in New Jersey that we typically don't see on a regular basis. Yeah, we got a lot of deer, though. What do we have now? 120 to 150 deer per square mile now.
Probably something like that, yes.
Yeah, it's very high. And we're going to talk about that on a future episode. We did talk about it a little bit last time, but we're going to specifically go into animal control. So soil testing is extremely important. You know, I like to take soil samples in the fall so that I get my results back and I know exactly what I need to do ahead of time. You know, if the soil needs lime or needs to be acidified or whatever, we can do it and we have time to do it. And this just shows when you take soil samples, you're going down anywhere from, 4 to 6 inches or more. You're removing any of the top organic matter when you put it in the soil sample bags that you send off to the Rutgers lab. You want to dry those samples out, and it's simple enough to dry them out. So we'll take like 15 to 20 cores randomly sampled from an area. Say if we're doing the front lawn or we're doing another sample from the vegetable garden, they would be two completely different samples, and you would mark them as such. And then you would put them in a bucket, stir it around for those, and that would represent that one area. Then we would dry that down, put that in a bag, and we only need to send about a pint of that to the lab for them to give us some of the macro and micronutrients as well as pH readings on that. So you want to do that. If you haven't done it in many areas of your landscape, you want to divide it up into the different areas, different planting zones, and take samples for each one of those. And you can contact your local cooperative extension office or go directly to the soils lab, but contact your cooperative extension office so you develop a relationship with them and find out more about what they have to offer.
Always questions at the office where they would call me, well, Ray, how much fertilizer should I put down? I said, well, you need a soil test. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't have time for that. Well, you're asking me how far is it to California from where? Where are you starting from? You don't know where you're starting. And I tell them that. And then one time, one of my overzealous master gardeners, I remember I got the soil samples back. And how many soil samples did you get? 20. Well, the person said that you should get one for every plant. So they got a soil sample for every tree and for every bush. I'm saying, no, I want to sell soil samples, but I don't want you to do that in the future, please.
Ray, you're an honest man.
Yeah.
Taking soil samples is so important to get soil tests. It's such good information to know what you're starting with and how to correct it. And when you fill in the form and send this out to the soil testing lab, you can say what kind of plants are going to be growing, whether it's vegetables or blueberries. And so the results will come back with recommendations that are custom for the plants that you're growing in your yard. And so you'll have all that information that's just for your specific site. And then if you have other questions, you can always call us or email us, and we can help you find what's going to work for your yard.
Bill, it's a real good point. The form, filling out the form extremely, as accurate as you possibly can. before it goes to the lab, because when Stephanie works on that and her team over at the Soils Lab at Rutgers, they need all that information. It needs to be very precise, so take the time to do it. And, Ray pointed out before with his story, that this is the first and most important step you can do, and farmers do this on a regular basis. Anybody who's trying to raise a crop and trying to make money in agriculture or keep their plants healthy knows how important a soil test is, because it's like that road map that Ray was talking about. You can't get from here to there if you don't know the pH of your soil. You won't know what type of plants are adapted to that soil condition, and you won't know how much fertilizer, which fertilizers, and whether you need micronutrients in that particular situation. So that soil test is going to provide a lot of information for you to get started. There's a lot of good information from Cooperative Extension in our New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. And if you go on and just put in New Jersey Ag Experiment Station, you'll find information that Bill and myself and Ray Samuelis and all of us have put on the site over many years pertaining to each plant and different diseases and insects that attack it. We have many wonderful specialists that work with us at Rutgers University, and we pull that entire team together to provide resources for everyone across the state. And the importance of us constantly doing research and keeping that research updated is that it allows us to get the most current information out to you. And because of our weather changes and new diseases coming in and new problems, we constantly have to do research to keep ahead of all these issues. We're going to show a video right now, which is a very good video, so don't sign up for some people logging off, but this is a really good video. You're going to want to watch it.
Bill, it's just incredible. So many plants in one place, they all seem so healthy. There's hardly any insect or disease damage to be found. It's amazing they can keep up with it all.
Well, one of their secrets is their outstanding integrated pest management program. To find out more, we spoke with Casey Sklar, the head of that program.
Hi, I'm Casey Sklar, and I'm the Integrated Pest Management Coordinator for Longwood Gardens, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about integrated pest management. Well, what is integrated pest management? Well, simply put, it's a blend of different tactics used together to combat pest management problems. It's a blend of tools, such as the use of a biological control, maybe buying or releasing a beneficial insect to control a pest insect, or the use of a cultural control, something like planting the right plant in the right spot, or a plant that's more resistant to a pest. And what is a pest? Just about anything is a pest in the eyes of an integrated pest management philosophy. An example of a pest could be anything. It could be an insect or a mite, it could be a disease, it could be a weed, and the types of tactics that you use to achieve that goal can be just as varied. You could choose to use natural control by just letting the weather take its course and either get colder or hotter and eliminate the pest problem. You could use cultural controls such as host plant resistance. It can be a physical control such as a trap that you might use for a rodent in a barn, and even the use of pesticides or chemical controls can be used. Usually we try to focus on those that are less toxic, better for the environment, such as a horticultural oil or an insecticidal soap. Integrated pest management is really a lot of things. It's a toolbox approach to pest management whereby you pick the most effective tool without going directly to the most toxic one. And you really try not to kill every single pest that's out there. You set a level that you can tolerate and try to manage the population at that level. And you use it in a stair-step approach. You start off using the method of control that has the least impact and move your way up as circumstances dictate. Here at Longwood Gardens, we employ integrated pest management philosophies throughout our garden. It's open 365 days a year, and there's about 365 acres that the public walks through, including 4 acres of conservatory space. A way we might manage a mealybug problem in our conservatory would be to use a biological control, such as releasing a beneficial insect to control our mealybugs. Or perhaps a chemical control would be the use of insecticidal soap to try and reduce those mealybugs. Out in our landscape, with an example of something like hemlock woolly adelgid, we might use something like monitoring the soil moisture levels, the water levels in the plant over time, because hemlocks really need a lot of water. That'd be an example of a cultural control. Or perhaps if those adelgid population levels were so high, we'd have to come in and use a spray of horticultural oil, and that would be a chemical control strategy. But we'd time it with the pest's life stages so that we made sure it was the most effective application possible. So you can see that even at Longwood, integrated pest management makes sense, and I think it makes even better sense when employed by a homeowner in their backyard.
Take care, everybody.